Okay, well, thanks to all four of these speakers for their interesting and diverse viewpoints on this issue of assessment and quality of research. I'm sure many of you have questions for them, so feel free to go ahead. I'm looking at you, Richard.
So they've been comparing the number of tweets in the Altmetrics that you calculate with the Altmetrics that Impact Story calculate, and they were finding up to a 50-fold difference. Now, one of the points that people make, you count things differently, and that's fine if the difference is 15, 20%, maybe 50%, but that's like a 5,000% difference between the two numbers. So I would go to the price if you're getting that difference, then those numbers are meaningless.
So just to repeat the question so everyone can hear it, the question basically is how likely do you expect to be able to get consistent numbers from all the different sources? And I'd like to ask the respondents to please speak close into the mic so that folks can hear.
Yeah, so I guess it's important to understand like where those differences in numbers always come from. I can kind of shout as well. Yeah, where the differences in numbers come from. So it's not actually so much a data quality problem as a question of the standards, like what data we collect. So for example, on the altmetric.com side, when we collect, say, tweets about an article, what we're doing is all the different versions of the article combined into one number, and that's because to the researcher, that piece of research is the same. It doesn't matter if it's the preprint or the PubMed abstract or the PDF or the full text. It's all the same kind of object. But actually, that's a subjective decision that we've made, right? It's not necessarily the case that every publisher wants the content, the conversation around the archive preprint, or the bioarchive for that matter, associated with the published article. So I'm confident that if we all kind of agreed on, what we should report on, I mean, like labeled it clearly, maybe that's the point, that we would be the same. It's not so much like a source of the data quality, at least not for the big ones. Whereas more of a problem is things like newspapers and magazines. So I mentioned like the New York Times versus all the other sort of long tail media outlets. Like, where do you draw the line there? Like, do we have to kind of all agree that if something doesn't have a circulation of 10,000 people or more, we don't include it? Like, what circulation numbers would you use? Like, that's a whole mess. So yeah, so I'm just going to lick myself because I said I was confident, and then
Actually, there was a really interesting talk, I think, at the Washington meeting by a computer scientist from the University of Virginia, and I'm blanking on his name. And he's done research specifically on Twitter, and that the way that Twitter system's built is that there is an inherent problem with the stream that I think as he described it as you can be fast and accurate and inexpensive, and Twitter went with 2 of the 3 because you can't have all 3. And unless you are the Library of Congress who gets the archive, even if you're paying for the pipe, the fire hose, you're not getting everything simply because of the way that the Twitter system is distributed. And I'm not a computer scientist to the point that I can explain this. I suggest that you take a look at the recording of his talk. But he lays out and actually published a paper on the data qualities of Twitter streaming, of the Twitter fire hose.
It's ZWZ at Virginia Tech.
ZWZ at Virginia Tech?
He's at the library.
Yes. It was a
That's like a smaller percentage, right? That's the same, like, they're going to be exactly the same. That's not a 5,000.
Yeah, that's the, yeah, I don't mind if that kind of, like I
Yeah.
said, 15-20%, but 5,000% is.
Yeah,
Right.
That, in quick answer to your question is yes, I'm completely comfortable with this.
And that's going to become less, the Twitter issue specifically is going to be less of having to sample is going to be less of a stumbling block because Twitter has now decided that for scientific research, they will allow scientists to have access to the full archive so they can set those plans up for you.
So a couple points. One, it depends on what altmetrics we're looking at. So, for example, Mendeley readership statistics aren't necessarily consistent across all the different platforms right now. That is something that we can make consistent. So, Twitter, news media especially, is going to be much harder. But it's definitely, maybe not 5,000 of these things, it's definitely okay if it's different. And that makes for better metrics overall if you have multiple posts that are competing to come up with a more robust calculation. That's what we have in citations.
Well, and
You're always using altmetric when you're comparing against altmetric rather than comparing using Scopus to compare against Web of Science.
And this is an area of potential research in that are there figures that, out of the 50 different metrics that could be calculated, which are the most reliable? And if we study, after having gathered and applied some standards to those metrics, after that process is over, you can still go back and do some research in terms of how is this measuring up to our expectations of validity. So this is probably going to be a multiple year iterative process.
Transparency in the individual collection is also important. So altmetric.com.
You guys want to come over here?
Yeah.
Do you want to bring a chair over here?
So the example that Ewan gave of what size publication qualifies as news media, for example, there are different ways to define that. There's not necessarily just one right way, but as long as there's, for example, a complete list of all the different sources that are being mined by Ewan, then there is that level of transparency. So you at least know that when you're comparing one journal to another journal using altmetric data, that all of those particular sources have been mined for both of those journals. And again, that's the same as Scopus and Web of Science making our publication lists transparent, so you know exactly what's in there, what coverage dates are, for the mass media that you're covering. And again, that's why, for example, Scopus and Web of Science are reliable, good tools for research assessment, while no one uses Google Scholar, because who knows what's in there.
Todd, did I see your hand up earlier?
So I'm interested in the qualitative analysis of post-publication platforms, because that seems like the most likely way to get at visibility without actually doing user visibility. It's like kind of harvesting the crowd's attempts at analysis. So I'm curious about how feasible it actually is to have workable results from that.
Okay, so the question, just for those of you who need to hear it, is about looking at doing a qualitative analysis of post-publication platforms as a way to get a view of reproducibility across the swath of literature.
Yeah, I think relying on the academic community to publish their failed replications, the evidence we have is that's very unsuccessful. So definitely there are cases where very high profile results that are not reproducible are surfaced very quickly. So the most recent example is the STAP stem cell sort of scandal where clearly there was actual blatant fraud involved in the actual experiments, and that came to light very quickly because it was a methods paper. So as soon as the methods came out, people wanted to apply them to their own research, and a live blog was actually set up where more than 12 different labs contributed their attempts at replicating the results, and showed that in fact that none of them could find a similar phenotype. But even for that example, I actually had a lot of problems with it because it wasn't a direct replication. So none of those findings were direct replications, and it was very difficult to interpret the results because they were using different starting material, the exact methods were slightly different. And so it didn't really tell you anything about the original papers, it just told you that maybe the findings couldn't be applied to other cells. Subsequently, it did result in significant investigation into the data that was in the original lab books, which showed manipulation. But I think that a lot of people sort of used that as an example of the community sort of correcting the literature very quickly. And what we've got a lot of evidence for now is that the literature does not correct itself. So the two studies that came out from the pharmaceutical industry, one of the quotes was, it didn't matter if more than 10 different academic labs reported the same result. They saw no correlation with the reproducibility in the number of different labs that were citing the papers that were publishing similar results.
You know, that STAT paper, Elizabeth, was a paper with very high numbers of blog posts and comments and social media activity, scores very high on altmetric.com. But when you look at the paper on Altmetric, you don't necessarily get the impression off the bat of that a lot of the volume of commentary has turned negative after the paper came out. You see a lot of press releases and things about the initial part of it. So did you look into that example specifically at all?
I haven't looked into that example specifically, but I think that wouldn't surprise me. I think the types of data source, the different sources are very important to consider. So you mentioned the post-publication review. So the thing that surprised me actually in the past year is how much commentary there is on things like PubPeer. So PubPeer, actually when you go to it, doesn't look like much, and it's run by, well, I don't know who it's run by, the point is it's anonymous. So two things surprised me about it. First is that how much people are talking about papers on it. So you should take a look, because actually there's quite a high volume of stuff. And then the second thing that surprised and shocked me a little bit is just, it's actually very negative. Like on all the other sources we track, like the attention is generally positive. So you get some stuff like, there's a arsenic live paper in Science, and it starts off positive, and then people are going like, hey, hang on, this is rubbish, and it turns negative. But generally, when people are talking about papers on Twitter, it's a bit of a, you wouldn't necessarily tweet about something that you dislike. And there hasn't been enough. I think we need to do more research into like why people tweet about papers, and we did a little study with Mark and Fenner a couple of years ago, but I think something larger scale would be interesting. But in general, it's kind of like a neutral sentiment or a positive one. And on PubPeer, it's much more people talking about, this figure looks like it's been faked, like this does not look like I could reproduce it, why did this get published in this journal, this kind of thing. So I think it is very important, to look at the different sources and have that kind of, to be eyeing the data itself rather than just going by the numbers.
I think we had somebody back over here. Any question first? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, first of all, it's a really great panel, so thank you all for the different perspectives. Coming from the humanities, digital humanities specifically, it sounded to me like a lot of what you're doing, although you didn't say it specifically, is actually creating bodies of knowledge and ways of thinking about data literacy, and particularly very messy data literacy, and then trying to give that back to the scientific community and show, or academic community, and show how their work can be diffused. And I was wondering if you thought of that as one of your primary outcomes, along with the metric, the numbers. Would that change anything that you are currently doing? Or is that just something that's coming along?
Elizabeth, I think it maybe more you.
I think that was within the context of, and sorry, the question was, how do these questions about alternative assessment tie into other forms of distribution, and how to awareness of content?
Awareness of content, but also awareness of data.
Awareness of
and awareness of how, scholars are aware of their own data, and their own data is public, but when you're trying to get a metric, and you start to think about, the relative accuracy of the Twitter fire hose, or other things like that. How much of that is being sort of published back as a way of raising awareness about the complexity of the landscape?
Now I'm rethinking my answer. I don't, that hasn't been a specific focus in terms of educating the community about the potential ways in which data is created in the network and the use of digital objects, and how that data informs understanding of those objects. That's not been a focus. However, it has been a focus, at least some of the conversations, and I mentioned this, in how these data can be applied in other uses. That they can be used for things like discovery, and they can be used for mapping the relationship between different objects, and creating novel, or at least exposing novel patterns in science. And, you know, this was some of the work that was done by Johan Bolin and Herbert von de Sampel in terms of betweenness centrality. How close is this object or the use of this object to that object? You know, how does one jump from this field to that field, from agriculture to microbiology? And what's the research path between those different fields? And so that's some of these conversations, but it's an interesting point.
Okay, well, let's thank all of our speakers for a very interesting session, and I'm sure we'll hang around for a few minutes if you have questions.